Broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studios in Phoenix, Arizona, it's time for Phoenix Business Radio, spotlighting the city's best businesses and the people who lead them.
Welcome to Phoenix Business Radio, broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studio inside Max 6 Conscious Workspace in Tempe, Arizona, where we help build businesses and connect you with the right people. I'm your host and Phoenix Business Radio Studio CEO, Karen Nowicki, and I am very excited about our conversation that we are about to embark on for the next hour or so. We've got a lot of things going on in our society these days, let alone the COVID-19 and quarantine, and then this spark around racism and this conversation that just continues to, ebb and flow. And are we getting where we need to go as a human race? I don't know. My prayer is that we are going to do that. And so we're going to have a conversation today with some friends of mine and a new fast acquaintance to see if we can bring some clarity, some understanding, some hope, and some direction and action around racism and its impact on small business and the arts. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the panel. And my role today will really be facilitator. I am never a good facilitator unless I kind of jump in and share some of the insights or the thoughts or the questions that I have. So I'll do that from time to time as well. And so on that note, let me introduce to you first Thomas Barr with Local First Arizona. He is coming into us via Zoom today, so he's on a screen. The rest of us are in the studio. Hi, Thomas.
Hey, everyone.
So glad to have you here with us, and thank you for making time to be with us for the conversation today. And Dre Harris, welcome, sir.
Hello.
Dre used to be a buddy of mine and just sit right outside the studio.
Sure did.
And every once in a while, we ping on Facebook or LinkedIn and text every now and again.
Yes.
And when Karen Loomis, who I'll introduce in just a moment, requested and said, let's do this, I said, I'd like you to meet Dre. So I'm happy that you're here.
Me too.
Thanks for being here. And Karen Loomis with No Mas Brands. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Thank you so much for pulling us together.
Of course. This is important.
It is an important conversation, and we think it's going to be one of many. We'll see how it goes today and the impact and the influence perhaps that we can share, offering others clarity and even ourselves. I'm looking forward to learning a bunch from you guys and would love to see that we continue this conversation, again, with the idea that we have, I'm going to use the word systemic change. Camilla Ross, correct?
That is correct.
I wanted to make sure you had your last name correct. And Camilla comes to us from Sedona and is an acquaintance of Karen's, a friend of Karen's, and an important part of the conversation, I think, representing kind of the art aspect.
Absolutely.
And where are some of our challenges with funding and really just being visible in the arts.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, good. On that note, I'm just going to turn it loose for, Karen, if you don't mind, you're the one who came to me and said, let's have this conversation. And can we do it on your platform on air? Because I think a lot of us are having these conversations anyway. And I always say to folks, I didn't say to you guys today because you've all been here except for Camilla another time or two at least. When people come into Business RadioX Studio, I like to say before we go on air, imagine that the five of us are having a coffee or a glass of wine or a meal together somewhere public. And someone comes and taps me on the shoulder and says, I'm embarrassed. I've been eavesdropping. Thomas has heard this thousands of times because he does his show with us. I am intrigued. The laughter, the camaraderie, the spirit in which you're talking about whatever the topic is, in this case, racism in small business and the arts. I need to know more about who you people are. Thank you for sharing the way you have, right? So that's what I want to tee it up for our listeners, that this is nothing more than a conversation. We're all coming to this conversation ready and eager to listen, to learn, and share a direction. So with that, Karen, tell us how this kind of came to you and why this is so important from your perspective.
I think it's really important to understand that as African Americans, Black people, whatever the label is that you want to use, and understand that these are labels that we're going to be using throughout this show today, mainly as a way for us to have a conversation. Sorry, we have to categorize in some way, and so please do not be offended when you hear us use the labels of color around people. So I just wanted to kind of set that out. Now, what I also think is very important, and I think it's a good place for us to start, is to consider that we all have arrived at this place that we are at today from different places. And I think that sometimes society wants to lump us all together and they forget that we all come where we are today from different places. So I think that it's important for each of us to kind of share where we come from so that you can understand what lens we're seeing the world through right now, because we all are different. And I think that's the most important thing that probably you can get out of this conversation is that every Black person doesn't have the same thinking. And I know that seems so obvious, but I really feel like it needs to be said, right? Because I don't swim. I tread water from here, that's not helpful. But all these stereotypes, I think, are based on the fact that we're all trying to lump people into one category. So let me just kind of start and give you a little understanding of where I came from. So I came from a military family. Dad was in the Air Force, military police, and I think that's important to note because the police are such an important part of what's going on with our society right now. So I had the opportunity to travel, as you would in a military family, from place to place to place to place. As a matter of fact, I was fortunate in the fact that my dad retired when I was 10 years old. So not only did I have the experience of going and, overseas, driving across the United States, living in all these different places and meeting all these different people and having to adapt to everything around me, I became really good at becoming a chameleon. But when you become a chameleon, you forget who you are. But I think that the Black community does a really good job of being really solid on who we are. But where I think that it's important to understand is that my dad made the decision to retire in Spokane, Washington, which has an African-American population of 2%. So what does that mean? It means that I'm used to being the one, the only one, right? I hear that. And so I have developed what I call coping mechanisms, survival, defensive mechanisms, any way just to be able to navigate the world. And so I recognized as an adult that the opportunities were not going to be there for me in Spokane, Washington. Do I go to Seattle? 90 days without sunshine? I think not. And even Seattle, only has 7% African American, where Seattle's diversity is on the Asian population. And, even in Phoenix, we have 6% African American, and American kind of plus or minus wherever you want to go. But where we rock in Phoenix with diversity is on the Hispanic side. And so while the diversity scale is very similar from the three cities that I just talked about, the attitudes are a little bit different. And so that has shaped how I approach not only business, but it's shaped how my interactions are with people. We were talking about networking earlier, so all of those interactions are based on where I came from. And so I'll let the rest of you kind of give us your background and where you came from.
No, that's awesome. And I can swim, but I don't do it by choice if I don't have to.
Bingo.
And I'm a swimmer, damn it.
Okay, so we're saying that maybe Black people we just really aren't good about the water. I'm good at floating on the water.
Yeah.
With a floaty.
I just don't understand the appeal.
Right?
You're talking to a swimmer, high school, college, lifeguard for the city of Tempe, growing up. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my
Good
God.
for you.
Yes.
You tell, though. I mean, because that's an interesting distinction right there, I think, is the fact that it's just, I think it's, if you think about it, it's probably, we're just not around pools.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's just cultural, doing other things. But I mean, I did grow up, like when I was younger, I grew up going to public pools and stuff like that, getting super dark out in the sun, And,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So background-wise, I think for me, something that's super important, and I won't preach at all, but like as a Christian man, I think it's important, and this will, I think, sort of shape or set in context the view that I come from. My hope for resolutions to issues of like systemic problems, issues of racism, things like that is not at all to be confused with being rooted in some man-driven system. My hope for reconciliation between people is not rooted in policy and politics. My hope for a resolution to these things is not rooted in anything temporal that I think can be offered in this world. And so for me, I think much of my perspective is informed by the reality that I think real reconciliation has to happen between people and God before it can happen between people and between each other. And so for me, I believe that the real hope for this world rests itself in the good news of Jesus, his death, burial, resurrection, and that anyone who casts himself at his feet can be forgiven, can be adopted, can be reconciled. And I think that that's where real unity can be accomplished, when people have new hearts, new desires, and are not ruled and driven by greed and things like that. So, and I think because that's my perspective, I've been able to say, hey, my hope is not in fixing the systems as the ultimate solution to anything. And so I think what that's allowed me to do is take a step back and to think real critically about how I approach thinking about systemic problems that we face in the world. And again, I think when your hope is not in something temporal to be the answer to all of the woes that you experience, I think that it allows you to see things potentially more accurately. And so I think for me, I do believe that there are, in fact, systemic problems that we face. Where I'm probably the outlier on this panel is that I don't believe that those systemic problems are rooted in racism. And I think that an important distinction should be made between systemic problems and issues of systemic racism. And I think that if we define systemic racism as any time a system is set up in a way that disproportionately affects a particular demographic, then that's what we call systemic racism. If that's the case, then I'm forced to agree with that definition, because I think anyone who looks at the numbers, any empirical data, just common sense will tell you if you live in America, minorities are more adversely affected by certain systems. And so my issue with that definition, though, is that that's redefining how racism has been defined throughout all of American history. It hasn't just been defined that a system disproportionately affects one people group. Systemic racism has always been defined around the idea that it's targeting, it's intentionally designed to adversely impact people who are Black or brown with that intention, whether it was designed that way or that came about later on. And so I think that we're having an issue with definitions. I think we're having an issue with semantics. And I think that stuff will be good to flush out in this conversation.
I was grabbing my computer just to have some of our notes that we had in our pre-conversation in front of me, so I might have missed this, or perhaps you don't even think it's necessary to bring the conversation. Can you, like Karen did, could you tell us a little bit about where you came from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Phoenix native, grew up here, so I missed the whole question, huh? I went all the way on another.
No.
Okay.
It was excellent, but I think because I know you, because I know you, I think it brings this rich context to who you are and where you're coming from.
Yep. And so, my introduction to the world was my dad going to the doctor saying, hey, what's wrong with my son? Doctor's like, what kind of question is that? And my dad said, well, me and his mother have been, smoking crack cocaine in the bathroom her entire pregnancy. I figured there's got to be something wrong with him. So if I seem off, thanks, Dad. But you got to make light of it, right? And so I think, that was my introduction into the world. And so I grew up, my dad fell prey to the crack epidemic in the 80s, introduced my mother to it. My mom is white, but we lived in a trap, grew up in a very rough environment, not an experience that a child should have to go through. Left home when I was 15, went into a rehab at 18, met Jesus at 21, flipped my whole world upside down and around. And so I think some of the rub with this is that people will hear this and they'll see, okay, cool. So he has had the real Black experience. But that in itself is problematic.
Yes, it is.
There is no such thing as a Black or the Black experience. And if you grew up in the hood or you grew up in the suburbs, those can't be the things that define whether you are Black or not. And so I've been in a tug of war with the Black community where I'm holding on to one side of my Black card and they're trying to take it away. And so that's a very real, interesting dynamic. I've matured. It used to hurt, used to get me angry. But I'm okay with being an outlier. I think I got my hands on some things that are really true.
Thank you.
I do think that, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I think that as an African-American woman, I always have felt as an outlier. And it's because of exactly what I said, 2%. How are you included when you are the one that has to explain to everybody else why your hair goes kinky when you get in the swimming pool and theirs doesn't?
Yeah, but I don't want to explain to people
But that's
why.
the point, right?
Yeah.
That's the point.
I mean, that's not my job.
Exactly.
Camilla, on that note, tell us who you are, or you could start with that.
It's not my job. I grew up in Massachusetts, back east, to two amazing nurses. Both of my parents were nurses. They moved us to an all-white neighborhood when I was 5. How about trauma? And so having to grow up in that environment, being the only Black family, moving into that environment and having to stake claim, if you will, to just be, it was difficult. And so by the time I turned maybe 10, 11, everybody else wanted to be, if you will, like us, whatever that means. And so for me, it was interesting. And so my dad was military. My mom was a nurse. My dad was a nurse. I grew up with 6 other siblings in this neighborhood, and having to figure out who you are in that moment of growing up in that neighborhood, and always, like Karen says, being the one and having to explain all the time, or seeing your parents having to deal with other parents just to be. And
just to be.
Everybody grows up or everybody's born into whoever they're born into. Nobody gets to choose. So why should you have to explain that? And so
White privilege.
It's just, we're in this amazing quandary, if you will. And I love God. I love God with all my heart. And to see people in this moment not loving. Love is that key that will bind and heal. And if we don't find that, we're in serious trouble. That's where I'm going to leave that.
Pause, right? All right. Thomas, tell us about you and where you fit into this conversation.
Sure. Well, I just want to say I appreciate being invited to participate in the conversation and appreciate all the perspectives being brought to the table. Hear very, very closely, Dre's story and his perspective on, like he said before, reckoning happening at home, right? And I'll tell everybody who I am in a minute, but I think where I come into play in this conversation is really the lack of awareness that I see perpetuated among the white collective and have my entire life, and the systems that exist that perpetuate racism on communities of color, and the lack of action that I see a lot of white people not taking in order to disrupt those systems, right? So while I agree, I totally believe, you've got to have that self-reckoning. You've got to have that reflection. You've got to work on those issues right at home first. But I believe that there's a call, at least personally to me, and should be a call to many people to look at how those systems are structured and make true intentions to try to disrupt them so that we have more inclusion and true diversity in thought and action and principle in priorities, right? And so you can look at any system. You can look at how 82% of teachers in the United States are white and think about how that is so tilted that who is conveying the stories, who's teaching our children, who's bringing them up, right? So every way that we look at a system, many people hear the word racist or racism and tend to think of it as an intentional action, right? We tend to think if you're saying something is, if I'm racist, that I do not like you because of your skin color or where you come from. When, to Dre's point, we get caught up in semantics, we get caught up in definitions and spend our time not getting to the true actionable steps we can be taking to solving the problem. And we end up just disagreeing on what it really means to be racist or what it really means to be in a culture of supremacy, right? So I've been involved. I've lived in Arizona my whole life, born and raised. I'm one of the 33% born and raised in this state. We're in a really unique state where many of the people that live here are from somewhere else. So we've always dealt with, a lot of, I think, identity issues as a state. Who are we and who's actually proud of this place? And we've seen that shift dramatically in the last 20 years. A lot of people still talk about back home as home and not here as home, even if they've lived here for 15 years. So my work is involved in Local First Arizona, and we represent over 3,000 businesses in Arizona. Our work is to communicate and educate about the importance of local ownership. And I truly believe that we can't have that conversation without talking about community wealth building for communities of color, how we need to prioritize the importance of investing in Black businesses, investing in businesses of color, and really truly looking at how systems are created to benefit white communities over communities of color. And how can we dismantle those systems and work towards more diversity? So I'll stop there. May have sparked some other thoughts, but really appreciate being here today.
We hope you've sparked other thoughts.
Well, I think, Thomas, you hit on something that's very important about supporting these communities. I especially think of the arts. Now, my relationship with Camilla is I met Camilla at a networking group when she had first come into the lovely state of Arizona and was looking for help to promote her business, her arts business. Through the years that we've known each other, it's a struggle. And without what Camilla's doing in the community, who else is going to represent the African American history that is in the culture, which does a really phenomenal job of sharing the stories of, I'm going to use this term that I typically don't do, our people. These stories are the stories that need to be written from the Black perspective. Sometimes some really great ones come from the white perspective, as Camilla knows.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So I'll let you kind of go a little bit, continue that conversation.
I had the privilege just recently of producing a play called Vivian's Music 1969 by Tucson resident Monica Bauer. And I'll tell you, if you have not read this play, you need to read it. Original Works Press puts it out. But the work is extraordinary because it takes us on the journey of a 14-year-old young woman who is from Omaha, Nebraska, and she is murdered by a white police officer. And so the story takes you on that journey, and it takes you on that journey as if, what if she, who was she? What life did she have? Let's talk about music, and we take you on that journey through music. There's some great music in this play, but what I found about the work is that it's really an eye-opener of our history's truth. And I'm going to say that American history is Black history because as a people, we help to define and build this nation as a whole. And to be excluded from it is doing a disservice to our country as a whole. And so that's what's important about this work. And I think that people should see it and should read it because it'll give you a great perspective on life from Omaha, Nebraska's point of view. Because when we talk about slavery, when we talk about racism, we're always picking that pinpoint of the South. Mm-hmm. But I'll recognize today that it's not just the South. It's just as much the North and just as much the Midwest and just as much as the West. So we need to, to look at that as a whole and as a people and define for ourselves what that looks like and how we deal with it and being mindful of how we deal with it. And I think through arts and theater, that is the best way because when people come to sit in a theater, I don't need to beat them over the head. I can present something and allow them to sit there, take it in, and leave with their own thoughts. And most of the time, I get phone calls months after the show is over, telling me how important that piece of work was and how important and that it changed their perspective on life and what they've been living and how they've been living it. And that to me is a testament to the work in and of itself. So I really want to thank Monica Bauer for writing such an amazing piece of work because it enlightens us to the truth of our history. And if we not recognize that history, we're doomed to repeat it, and we need to stop that repetition.
But I think, I think that what you just hit on when you said the truth of our people, of our story, and we need to own that. And because society has made us kind of shy away from our own truth and our own story, just as a means to navigate this white world, it has diluted our ability to have an impact on the economy as well. And that's really one of the things that I really wanted to bring out of this is, one, the awareness that Camilla's talking about, because, you know, I'm trying to do more of these talks to help people really learn and to hear and to maybe even consider something that they hadn't considered before. And the time is now, because people have that little bit of that crack of light coming into their brains that is opening up to maybe be, maybe hear something they might not have heard before. And these are wonderful people. People, just because you don't know doesn't make you not a good person. I just did one of these a couple weeks ago, and we were doing a Zoom side-by-side with myself and a white business coach. And I could not see her. I'm talking, and I can't see what she's doing until I'm done talking. And she's bawling, and she's crying. And I'm just talking away because I can't see her, But so my point is that when people become aware, that's when they're more likely to take action. And that's really the reason why I brought us all together, so that we could share our stories of what does it take for you to become more aware, just to listen and to maybe revisit some of your belief systems, because that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, can I chime in?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
All right.
please.
So I think some of the issue, right, that I run into, and these are, this is just me keeping it 100, right? So I think that when we start to talk about awareness, my concern is that we have a demographic of people, let's call them white people, that we're saying need to become more aware of certain things. My rub is that I think we're trying to make them aware of things that don't exist. And that's a bold statement, right?
That is bold.
I think that
yeah.
I think that that was where things start to become problematic for me, is because, well, you need to become aware of white privilege. Well, I mean, if we sit down right now and we have a conversation about this stuff, if white privilege is that if you take a black person and a white person who are, say, equally poor as each other, the white person, just by virtue of being white, has a advantage over that person, to prove that is a very, very difficult thing. And then what people begin to do is they use either anecdotal testimonies, right? So that's one-sided testimonies where I get to hear from one person. I have no idea about the context. And it's not to undermine anyone's genuine experience where they're racially discriminated against. I want to listen to those with a posture of love, but not be expected to accept them as gospel truth wholesale just because you're emotional about it. I've experienced all kinds of things too that you should be willing to call into question. And stories get told over and over and over and over and over again. And then they begin to take on a life of their own and get embellished in ways.
They become the truth.
Absolutely. And so for me, I think that if we are going to have a conversation about what white people need to become aware of, let's make sure that we're having them become aware of the right things. And I think that there's this presupposition that when we look back on our history, the only thing I see people talk about when we do historical analysis is Jim Crow and slavery and redlining and segregation and all of those things. I think that the real systemic problem that I see the Black community facing is, and another bold claim, a leftist narrative from the moment you come out of the womb that leads you to think that so guys like LeBron James, right? He'll say we're being gunned down in the streets, for instance. Right? And then you go to CNN and MSNBC and they're like, you're being gunned down in the streets. You're being gunned down in the streets. 9 unarmed Black men got killed in 2019. I'm not being gunned down in the streets. There's 47 million Black Americans. I'm not being gunned down in the streets. And so if we're going to have a conversation about what people need to become aware of, I think that before we start trying to get white people to understand stuff, I think we need to revisit our history and we need to take a look at whether we are rightly interpreting the events and take some real empirical looks, get away from just the anecdotal emotional testimonies and start to really dig down into the facts, because the facts don't care about how you feel.
But that's true across the board in almost anything, is that, it seems like with the current administration that the attack on media has become this point that we're all rallying around and using it as an excuse for why we don't understand each other or why we can't all get on the same page. It's because the media, it's fake news. It's that, well, let me tell you, my life is not fake news. And so when I see struggles that to Dre's point, that I can't 100% say is because of racism, I can guess. I can't go and put numbers on how many of those, 200 proposals I put out over the last 8 years, how many of them I got or didn't get because of racism. But I think where I look at this world today is something really fantastic has happened amidst all this ugly. And I know that this is a really hard concept, and I don't feel shame, because I never feel shame for the words that come out of my mouth, because they're really very well thought out. But when I was starting my business 8 years ago, and I was going through the naming process and the branding process, and what do I want to be to my clients, and who do I want to work with, I had a name that was very brand biased. It was very African American, and I ran it across one of my sisters who is a little bit more business savvy. None of my family members are entrepreneurs, so you have to keep that in mind. And I ran it by her, and she said, I can't do it, Karen. It'll hurt your number. You'll kill your business before it started. She wasn't wrong. That was why I was testing it. I was testing it on if a Black sister is saying this is going to hurt you, I'm thinking, okay, I have to listen to that. But here we are today, 8 years later. And guess what I realized? This is why I'm saying something very good has come out of it, is I realized that my entire brand needs to be set on a racism platform. What I don't mean is I'm coming out with, fists and all of this, but what it means is I'm no longer shying away and pretending I'm white.
It's funny, you talk about what's in a name. So when I was younger, I had a young white girl that came to babysit for me, and her name was Jacinta.
Yay!
And so with that name came stuff. She would go and apply for a job. They would never call her back. She would call and ask about her application. Oh, well, it's in the process, they would tell her. And she would call, and then she would call, and then she showed up one day and asked about the application. When the woman saw her and then saw her name, she said, oh, so you're Jacinta. So with that point, what's in a name is everything.
Yes.
I hope it's appropriate. That's my station, so I'm going to do it anyway. You're all on my playground. I want to share from a white woman's perspective a little bit about some of the experiences I've had. And Dre, you spoke to it around personal responsibility and having a relationship with God and coming to that point. You mentioned trauma. I think when I look at where we are today, and again, from the only place that I can, Karen Nowicki's place, and the name Karen, we laughed about it in our pre-show call because there's two Karens here, and all those crazy memes, and that Karen this. But I say that because I used to sit at the dinner table in my first marriage, and with a very white family, and would have a grandfather who would bring into the conversation, with no relationship at all, the issues that he had with Black African Americans, whatever. And he had words, right? He had names. And even talking about it right now, I never understood it. And I was 29 when we had our first kiddo. And I would have to leave the table because I felt like I didn't have a voice at the time, but it didn't make sense to me, because I am about love and light. And so here's what I want to ask. With this new conversation we're having now after George Floyd's murder, I'm the one who on Facebook or LinkedIn will say, we got to love each other, love and light. And we just really have to, and I'm hearing you all say the same.
Not me. I'm opposed to that.
I know, which is why I'm bringing it up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's real for me. Mm-hmm. I want to offer that. I want to honor that. It is true for me to my core. And I love that I'm being challenged. And you and I have talked about this on social media. I love that I'm being challenged to say, not enough, not enough to pray, not enough to, just say, I love you, man.
Or love thy neighbor.
Right.
My neighbor that could be the racist.
And yet, what is it that I should be doing as a business owner and an advocate for for humanity and specifically my Black brothers and sisters?
If you're loving, you're doing. And so for me, when I love someone, I'm actively engaged in the process of loving them and doing things for them. Hi, how are you? Do you need help? How can I help you? You have this great business. How can I help to enhance your business? All of that comes from a place of love. But if you're not asking that question and being in that loving place, how do they know?
And on a regular basis, not just when we have to watch someone be murdered on the street. It
has to be consistent.
So your story, I think, is one that I think I've heard from, like, I don't know, I feel like every white person I know has got a racist uncle, you know? Like, and it's almost like a rolling joke with my friends now.
I mean, if this many majority doesn't, supposedly if we have this much trouble in the racism in our society, everyone's got one. Probably even in my family.
Well, and that's the piece that I'd want to add is that, well, I had a context where any time I spent with my dad, which was spotty throughout my childhood, and then I had 3 years with him, and then I left home. And so, but from my dad, all I heard was honkies and crackers and how bad white people are. And so for every story that a white person has about their racist uncle, I would argue that a Black person has about their racist uncle. And so my dad is 100% racist against white people. And I'm like, Pop, you married like 30 years ago. Like, you married my white mom. Like, I'm half white. My wife's white. My son is half white. Like, what do you mean? And then, well, you don't count. What does that mean? I'm not fake half white. Like, I'm actually, that is who I am. Now, growing up, I was Black with a white mom. That was my identity. Mm-hmm. I wasn't half white. I was Black with a white mom. Like, I love being Black, and I embrace that over and above. And so, but when you ask the question of like what you can do to be helping, I think I'm going to give, again, a contrary word of advice. I think that the best thing you could do is not focus constantly on this issue of racism or systemic racism, or do what I believe is enforcing a false narrative. I think the best thing you could do for Black people, or for the disenfranchised, or for people being adversely, disproportionately affected by systems, is to figure out real practical ways to help contribute to their upward mobility. Go help a young Black girl graduate high school, not have a baby out of wedlock, encourage her to really consider the implications of a nuclear family, and help her to hold down a job. If you do those 4 things, then guess what? She's probably has so low of a statistical likelihood to end up in poverty that it's a moot point. And so go do some practical things. Don't get caught up in this mess of what I think is a false narrative, because anecdotal testimonies are not sufficient. And I take people's testimony so serious that it's driven me to go back and evaluate these systems to see everybody's saying this is the case. These systems must be inherently racist against Black people and minorities. And what I found is that the testimonies and what is actually happening in the systems, they're not lining up. And so when you doubt a person's testimony, I feel like what the narrative that is framed is that you're either saying that they don't know how to interpret the world, so they're stupid, or they're not trustworthy, so they're a liar. And what I'm saying is no. I think that Black people have been pumped a narrative for so long that we interpret anything that could even have a chance of being interpreted as racist as that.
So don't contribute to that.
Can I comment on this?
Yes.
Of course, can't contribute to that.
Do you guys mind if I open this soda?
Open it up. Do it.
Sorry.
Get your soda fixed.
Okay.
So here's where, if I was at all to critique my parents, because that's just not right. I mean, really, right?
But if I did,
which I'm gonna, because that's what I do, their decision to move, to retire in Spokane, Washington, was done with the right intentions. Mm-hmm. But what they did was, and they recognized this 30, 40 years down the road, is they separated us from our culture of Sacramento, California, where there's a much higher African-American base there. The culture is much more supportive of African-Americans, and our entire family is in California. None of those people ever came up to Spokane, Washington. So we have you know how a lot of families have the nieces and nephews and cousins and everybody's grown up together? No, not my family. But so how I would describe it to people, and it's kind of came out of that conversation I had with that other group that I was referencing before, is this gal that I was co-presenting with said that she was raised to be a very nice white woman. I was raised to be a very well-behaved Black white woman. Because guess what? They knew and they hoped that by us being extremely educated, well-spoken, intellectual, and having all of these successes, that it would overcome our skin color.
Yep.
And it doesn't.
But why is that why are those things equated? Like, why is education and well-spoken and all of those things, like, what makes you feel like, do you know that their intention was that they wanted you to be white? Or, and I'm not trying to question your experience, but I am intelligent. I have a good vocabulary. I write well.
No, I'm saying that my parents knew early on that race is an issue. So in order for your children to potentially survive and have some successes, these are the things you need to do. For example, if I like to play the language of using ain't and all that fun stuff, it's not well accepted.
It's almost like, when you're growing up in that neighborhood, like I grew up and you grew up, it's giving your child that leg up. Okay. And that's what our parents did for us. Because they knew what they went through. And they did not want us to have to go through those same things. But little did they know we had to walk that path anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up, she's not Black enough, just by the way that I spoke. Mm-hmm. So how do you go with that?
Or you don't sound Black.
Right?
I don't know what that means.
I want to touch on a few things that have been brought up here. And I think it's the underlying foundation of this is that race is really complicated. And when you're just white or come from an Eastern European background, if that's what white is, right? You don't have to self-reflect because many people don't have to self-reflect if you're in a white community because most of the people around you are white. Most of the people that have taught you are white. You likely didn't have to go through a lot of the struggles that most communities of color experience. You might live within a mile of a Whole Foods, most likely, right? You might not have people in your family that had to join the military. You might not know anybody that's ever been on drugs, right? All of these types of things you more than likely have not had to self-reflect on. Where in communities of color, more than likely you've experienced more than one of those things through growing up. And I think where it gets complicated is when Dre, a commonality I have is I'm mixed race too, right? I'm Mexican and white, but I look white. So the community accepts me as white. Or if I'm in Latino spaces, the Latino community accepts me as Latino, right? So race is complicated. And I think when we talk about white privilege and we talk about power and we talk about racist systems, those things white communities tend to become defensive about rather than self-reflective about because they don't have to most of the time experience the struggles that come along with them. So to your point, Dre, yes, if you want to help the Black community, go find that person and help them with upward mobility, but also look at the systems that you're contributing to oppress the masses of communities of color from being able to upward mobilize, right? Look at nonprofit organizations and the number of them that their boards have no communities of color represented, right? Look at Fortune 500 companies and how many of them are led by white men. And what do we need to do within the systems to help communities of color build that mobility, right?
So with the nonprofit issue, though, I think that the real problem in regards to a lack of diversity on boards needs to be viewed, or what needs to be really looked at and scrutinized is the tendency of the Black community to self-isolate. And so it's not just like, I think Black people are all just like, hey, let me on your board, let me on your board, let me on your board. I think a lot of times the narrative that, again, we've been told.
They don't even ask you, though, Dre. For real, though, because I'm on a nonprofit, okay, and I operate one. And so predominantly it is men-driven, okay, most of them. And you have that component. So they don't even come to ask because they don't even think it's necessary.
And I haven't worked with a nonprofit yet that didn't have Black people on the board. And most of the people that have propelled me forward in my business career have been white women.
But I think that's because you're associating with people who are more like-minded and progressive-minded. I think that is, and that's why I said, when I chose to make my business about being white versus choosing to make my business represent who I am, I've lost that opportunity to have progressive, like-minded people work with me. And so instead of protecting myself from racism, I've gotten in the way of opportunities to find those people who are very much like me.
Okay, so here's my fear, though. My fear is this, and I understand where you're coming from there, but here's my fear. My fear is that oftentimes we look at the past and we look at injustices, and then we use our logic to say, this seems like a reasonable solution. So, for instance, we should care about diversity and inclusion. So let's go and let's create rhetoric around diversity and inclusion, and let's say everybody needs to care about this. But then no one says, okay, here's your intention, but intentions don't determine outcomes. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that, right? So intention doesn't determine outcomes. What I see is that people will say, here's the intention, and then assume that what's the outcome of it is actually really good. And when you go and look at the data, I would argue that you have less diversity being accomplished with the whole diversity and inclusion push. If you go and look at studies that have been done at schools in New York, you have less Black people since they started pushing this stuff. Another one, you go and look at the level of venereal diseases. They're like, hey, let's go start teaching sex education in schools. And so then what you see is in 1960, you had half the amount of gonorrhea cases than by the end of it when they started teaching sex education. So you see a massive spike when you start doing it. So I don't care about your intention. Man, it's so hard to not use swear words sometimes. I don't care. I don't give a beep about your intentions.
It's internet radio.
I care. I care.
Just saying.
I care about the outcomes that are there. And so I'm going to stop talking. But like when I think about the idea of liberals, white Democrats coming to the table saying, we want to fix the problems of the Black community.
You can't
I don't want, and so even when I start hearing language like, and I know, Thomas, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you mentioned some things earlier. I'm like, how about you just leave us alone for a while? Because for me, people only mention, in the first half of the 20th century, you only mention the bad things like segregation and Jim Crow and redlining. When you go back and look, if you do a real historical analysis of the first half of the 20th century, we were doing good. We were doing better economically then than we are now. We had 40% decrease in poverty from 1940 to 1960. I want to be left alone. I don't even know if we're having this conversation.
Okay, but let's talk about 1921. I don't want to be left alone. Okay, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yes.
One of the most wealthiest Black communities ever.
Yep.
But what happened to that?
Sure.
They came and they burned it down to the ground on a lie.
Yep.
But a particular situation, though, of racism, it doesn't have any indication that all Black people during that time then saw a massive decrease in their upward mobility.
But how does you wanting to be left alone not line up with what you said earlier around isolation?
Yeah.
Yep. And all I mean by left alone is I would like for white politicians to stop trying to fix all the problems in the Black community. That's what I mean.
We need to get more Black leaders elected.
Okay, hang on.
Get white people out of the way sometimes.
But hang on, here I got to give you guys this stat because I'm all about
Come
numbers.
up on your mic, Karen.
I'm all about numbers, and here's my issue. So we're sitting here talking about boards and number of Black people and white people trying to help us and all of this. So let me throw this number out. The number of Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies peaked in 2002 with 12. Today there are 4.
So then can I state this? Because this is important.
Yes, please do.
This is massively important. Disparity, we talked about this, only proves disparity.
Yep, but that's where I'm starting from. I can only start from numbers.
But what I'm saying is that people don't just start there, they stop there. And so what I'm saying is that the presence of disparity doesn't do anything to answer questions of why that disparity exists.
I could give you numbers that can back up why, but I didn't think that we wanted to go into that in the next 2 minutes, but I can tell you exactly why with numbers, that's happening.
But I think the why is what is massively important, because you hear stats like Black people are 2.5 times more likely to get killed by police officers than what the story that's told is you need to be afraid.
Yeah, but when we're talking corporate America, I can tell you right now, the system blows. And that's my blow is the word I'm using instead of the word.
And does it blow because it's racist, or does it blow?
It blows because people, and this is back to your original point, because the way corporations are structured is for you to have no you. is for you to be a cog. And so what happens is that processes and systems evolve and create this track that people are just trying to get through to hire to find the warm bodies in their chairs. And so while you're saying it may not be racism, but because it's the white people making the decisions in the HR departments, that's the fail, because we can never get to climb. We don't get that upward mobility if we can't even start in a position with any kind of relevance, or, I mean, like how many ceilings do we hit? How many people get in the way of our upward mobility because they don't know that they're getting in the way of it? So you can't just walk away and say, I want to be left alone. No, what I want is you to pay the frick attention to people around you who might need your help, because I know that it's really easy. I work out of a home office. I'm not around people all day. If you're bugging me, I can just shut social media down. I can just talk to dogs all day. But here's the fact of the matter. I need you as much as you need me. But I know I need you. But white people don't know they need us. And that's where, to me, it feels like we're having problems, is until you realize that you're not going to get a different thought process. Maybe not. I'm saying that we're all different, but that's why you look for diversity, is because all of these struggles that we're talking about have brought us to where we are today, that give us a different foundation from most white people. I was in a conversation this morning on a group discussion, and this is what was said about the Netflix documentary on Black women CEOs. This is what the white women were saying. And I'm saying this for a categorization. How do they get? I was so impressed with their courage and their how do they get that courage? Life. Being Black gives you that. If you've made it this far and you've at least had some limited success, it's that courage that you put on your back that gives you the strength to continue to walk into rooms where you're the one.
And I guess what I would say is that we agree if what you mean is that HR departments should care about the least of these. They should care about the most vulnerable. They should care about those who, okay. But that's a very different conversation than having a conversation about racism. That's a conversation that says, hey, we want to create equity, so then let's do that. But to make the argument that based off the disparity, that means that HR companies are inherently, HR departments are inherently racist.
That is absolutely not what I said.
That's not what she said.
Nope. I'm saying that people do what they know. And if all you know is things that are in your world, everything else seems odd, and you're going to just have an aversion to it, a reaction to it, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. It just is. I mean, what we keep talking about the word race, and we keep forgetting there's a whole spectrum before you even get to full-on racism. What about just general bias? And I think that the general bias is what we're talking about right now from an HR department.
And I agree with you there that absolutely people should get out of their lane. They should try to diversify their circles of influence.
But people don't do it unless they're forced to. Unless you are, this is the problem that I have. Unless somebody puts legislation, and this is where, unfortunately, we do get tied into politics. Unless somebody puts those kind of rules in place, everybody else just, once this all dies down, once the next big news thing hits, right now, nobody's even talking about COVID. Right. So once the big news hits, we're all moving on, and racism is not the hot topic. I'm riding this bus right now because this bus is going to be a very short trip.
And I'm not sure we're going to look back at the end of this and see that all of this conversation about racism actually propelled the Black community forward.
No, I don't have that expectation.
No, I don't have that expectation.
I don't think, truthfully, if you want to talk about what we call systemic institutional racism, which starts at the individual level at some aspect, that is not going to change in my lifetime. I'm 57 years old. I have no expectation that's changing my life, and it's not changing my daughter's lifetime. But if we start now, maybe we can get the thinking and the awareness to shift, that some of these millennials and these younger kids will start to understand this a little bit better. But I don't have that expectation, and maybe it's an age difference.
Unless we're trying to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist.
Oh.
Okay.
I love opinions.
So I'll just say one thing. Based on what I'm seeing among the white collective in the country right now, for some reason, the death of George Floyd has ripped the carpet underneath white communities and caused them to self-reflect in a way I've never seen before. In a way I think all of us would agree we've never seen before. White Fragility is the top-selling book in the United States right now. For some reason, this event has caused us to self-reflect. And I would, for any white person listening and any white person that we talk to, drive home the message that we need to stop being defensive, whether or not we agree about what these terms mean: prejudice, discrimination, racism, supremacy. Stop being defensive and start reflecting, because the doubt that I've heard in anything changing from all of you should be the biggest shame of our country that the white community needs to self-reflect about.
I agree.
I think we can definitely agree that, and this is one of the things I express, because I have a lot of offline conversations, because, you know, you start something on Facebook, if you don't take it offline, it doesn't matter. And so there's not tone, there's not context, there's not all kinds of things. There's not this, right? And so when I go offline, I think one of the things I absolutely would want to caution, you know, my white evangelical friends is like, don't use my words as an excuse to not go be introspective. If you do have bias and prejudice and all of those things. But I would also say that this is a great time for Black people to go do the same thing, and for everybody to go
every
and do that.
person to do the same thing.
Absolutely. And so I think all of us have prejudices. All of us have stereotypes. I mean, I hung out with guys from the Middle East because I go to a church that's catty corner from ASU. And I asked them, hey, what's your biggest beef with America? I'm thinking they're going to talk about capitalism, all kinds of stuff. The guy looks at me and he's like, you don't call your mom every day. I'm like, yo, I might be a racist. I'm like, I had a completely different expectation about what you were going to tell me is wrong with me culturally. And so I think that, yeah, we need to get out of our boxes. But again, I think a conversation about equity is a fair conversation. I think that when we begin to focus on racism, I think we rob ourselves of the progress we're trying to make.
We are just a couple minutes shy of the top of the hour, and I want to make sure each of you have an opportunity to say, you know, a last piece. I do hope this conversation will continue. I don't know if it would be the five of us, but I welcome that opportunity. And for those of you listening, we would love, of course, to hear, you know, where this went for you and what your thoughts and opinion are. And again, where you are motivated to take action. Camilla, would you mind sharing with us first your lasting thoughts? I know that's a lot of pressure.
Pressure is good pressure. I just think that people need to be in that self-reflective mode, because it's real important. When we self-reflect, we're going to find out who we are and where we sit in this large sphere of everything. And when you sit with yourself, and I love myself, I'm an introvert. I love being with myself. When you sit with yourself, you will find more often than not that you have a lot more in common with other people than you think. And by having that conversation with them and being honest and open about it is real important. Honesty has to come first. We live in this global world where this racism, and I don't care how you define it, what you look at it, it exists. It's not some myth that people, you know, think it doesn't exist, because it's real to so many. And if someone's to me, this is how I'm feeling, I need to honor how they're feeling, and I'm not going to discredit how they're feeling. And I am going to say, hey, let's have that conversation. Tell me why you feel that way. Do not be afraid to have a conversation with people. White America needs to have a conversation, not only with themselves, but with everybody else. And that's all I'm going to say.
Karen.
What I want to remind people is today's not the day to go look for your Black friend. You know what I mean? Meaning, you can't have this agenda of, I am now open to learning more about racism and people of color, so I am going to put it amongst myself. So I don't want that to be your outcome. What I want you to do is that self-reflection, but also to think, what personal action can you do? And for most people, one of the things I said this morning in this group was, there's a special place in my heart for that white individual who stands up amongst the social and economic cost and says, that's not the right thing to say. That was racism. There's a very special place in my heart for people like that. Are you that person? If you're that person, you know, we need more people like that. That's been part of the problem. We don't have enough.
Yeah, so I guess I'd say two things. One, I hope that people try to grab hold of a more eternal perspective, right? We're talking about temporal things in this world. And the last thing I'd want to do is set up a world where people get to live comfortably just to be ushered into an eternity apart from God. And so I think that people need to think about some deep, big, eternal things and not get too caught up in this life. And so this life is a vapor. I think the other thing that I would say is I think we've talked a lot about white people. My message to the Black community and to a young Black man who is where I was when I was 21, I want them to know that regardless of the narrative that you hear over and over and over and over and over again, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry.
I just want to make sure Thomas is back.
Got it. Yeah, regardless of the narrative that you hear over and over and over again, you can go be successful. You can avoid having children out of wedlock. You can break the cycles that have been happening. You can get out of the trap. You can go and reach heights and goals. And I think human potential is remarkable. And so I want them to know, yes, you can. There isn't a white person around every corner that's ready to arrest you or lynch you or kill you. You can go make it. So go do it. Take responsibility of your life. And before you and God, go and decide what you need to do to make something of your life.
Again, appreciate being invited to the conversation. I think I'll share that, based off an experience that Karen Loomis and I just had over the weekend, where, this conversation was put together through the power of a Black voice and other Black voices, and invited a white and Mexican man to participate. And digitally, I was actually called out for that. Mm-hmm. Said I don't have a place in the conversation of racism. And I took the position to try to understand where this person was coming from, to try to meet them where they were at.
You were very nice.
But at the end of the day, I think that we tend to, as white people, even when we have accomplished some type of perspective on these issues, still tend to put ourselves in the place of knowing what's best, rather than elevating the power of Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices. And so I think that the conversations within white communities are important, but I think that the discomfort that comes with having and participating in these conversations are the true barriers that people in white communities don't know how to step into. So if you are white and listening and have the opportunity to step into one of those conversations, do it and be uncomfortable and stumble on your words and say the wrong thing and get corrected and learn about it and take in perspectives and reflect on those too, and use any ounce of influence you have, whether it's the people you sit down with at the Thanksgiving dinner table or your social media followers, to listen to more Black voices too. Because most likely, if you're a white person, the majority of people around you are white as well. And by elevating more Black voices, you're creating more of a diverse perspective for those people to reflect on too. So if you're a business owner, if you're a father or mother, an individual, that would be my last piece of, I don't know if that's advice or a recommendation, but I appreciate being here.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for joining us. And I appreciate your stance. And who knew we were going to be called out for bringing in the white face? I mean, who knew? It's funny how people are.
This has been incredible. I know that there are hours and hours more that we could.
It's a great conversation.
It's a conversation, right? Yeah, that's the important thing, and that's how we roll here at Business RadioX. We just want to have conversations that people, again, can eavesdrop in and take away, a new level of understanding. Maybe step out of their comfort zone a little bit, which is what each of you are inviting all of us to do. We're all taking personal responsibility to say, I'm willing to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to speak up. And I would hope the people around me are going to give me a safe place to do that. And when it isn't safe or it's uncomfortable, that I'm going to have a louder voice.
We can disagree and still love each other, still collaborate, still rock together. And I think that needs to be a part of the prevailing message that's out there. We don't have to agree to collaborate and help one another.
Mm-hmm. But that's why theater is so important, because we can sit in that theater space and have that conversation in a safe, nurturing environment. And so when you support theater and the arts, you're supporting life and people.
Love it.
Plug.
Yeah, beautiful and great way to end our conversation for today. Mic drop. So for those of you listening with us live, you will find this as a podcast in a couple of days, and you will have links to each of these very special people's websites as business owners. And of course, we invite you to connect and continue to be part of the conversation with us. You've been listening to Phoenix Business Radio, broadcasting live from within the Mac 6 Conscious Workspace. Some media leans left, some lean right, and we lean business. Until next time, I'm Karen Nowicki. Thanks for listening.